Let's start with Teen Wolf, because honestly, where else do you start? The iconic 1985 movie treats lycanthropy like magical puberty. Scott doesn't get hunted or traumatized. He just kind of levels up. His dad already has it, it runs in the family, and the whole thing functions more like unlocking a cheat code than suffering a curse. He gets faster, stronger, more confident, and all of a sudden, the basketball team needs him. The wolf in this version is basically a social currency upgrade. The MTV series flips that and builds something way more complicated. Here, the bite is an infection passed down from alphas, and most people who get bitten don't actually survive it. But surviving isn't even the impressive part. The rare thing is becoming a true alpha, which has nothing to do with how strong you are or how many wolves you've beaten. It comes from moral strength, actual character. Scott McCall earns his red eyes not by killing his way to the top, but by refusing to. In a mythology built around dominance, he's going against the grain in every way possible. And then there's the eye color system, which is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that show. Gold eyes mean you're a beta and you're relatively clean. Blue means you've taken an innocent life and you're carrying that guilt in your irises forever. Red means you're an alpha. It turns the supernatural hierarchy into something visible, something you can't hide. Your sins are literally glowing out of your face. That pack mentality in this universe isn't just social either. It's a literal power source. Alphas get stronger from the loyalty of their pack or killing their own betas to basically steal and use their power. Betas pull strength from belonging. Lone wolves, the Omegas, are the most vulnerable people in the whole mythology. Not because they're weak individually, but because isolation costs them something fundamental. The show borrowed that from real wolf biology, or at least the pop science version of it, and turned it into an emotional argument about community. Teen Wolf weaves its modern horror around ancient myth by tracing werewolves back to Greek legend, specifically King Lycaon, whose curse by Zeus later evolved through druidic rites into the pack and emissary system seen in the show. Going even deeper, we see them pulling from global folklore, Japanese kitsune and oni, Irish banshees tied to the Morrigan, and the Norse wild hunt, reframing each myth into grounded supernatural rules. Bitten takes the biological angle and runs it to its most logical extreme. This isn't a curse, this isn't magic. Werewolves in this universe are essentially a species, a rare genetic strain that can be spread through a bite, but the survival rate is brutal. Most people who get bitten just die. Elena Michaels survived, and she's the only known woman to ever do that, which makes her immediately the most interesting and most politically complicated person in any room full of wolves. The transformation here is not cinematic or cool, it's bone snapping and body breaking, and the show doesn't let you forget how much the human frame has to be destroyed just to make room for what's coming through. Packs in this world operate like extended family dynasties, and they police who get turned with extreme caution because an uncontrolled population is an exposed population. The politics of who gets to become one of them is taken as seriously as any royal succession. Bitten takes a much more grounded approach to werewolves, treating them less like a myth and more like a rare biological condition passed down through family bloodlines. In this world, being a werewolf is usually inherited through the father, which makes Elena Michaels a huge exception, as the only woman ever to survive being turned by a bite. Instead of gods and curses, the story focuses on strict pack rules, old European traditions, and the idea that werewolves are a hidden branch of human history that later connects to a much larger supernatural world. The Vampire Diaries and the originals take a completely different approach and ground lycanthropy in divine punishment. In the Vampire Diaries and the originals, werewolves don't come from ancient gods or science. They're the result of a curse born out of revenge. About 1,500 years ago, a powerful witch named Inadu, also called the Hollow, was killed by her own people, and with her last breath, she cursed them to transform into wolves every full moon, creating the first werewolf bloodlines. That curse still shapes the rules of the species today, from painful, moon-driven transformations to deadly venom, while rare characters like Klaus and Hope exist as once-in-a-kind loopholes that break the normal laws of nature. A key detail is that the curse stays dormant until you trigger it yourself, specifically through your first intentional kill. So you can live your whole life not knowing what you are, and then one moment of rage or survival or bad luck activates something you can never put back. Klaus Michelson breaks the mythology wide open just by existing. As an original hybrid combining vampire and werewolf, he doesn't follow any of the standard rules anymore. He transforms when he wants to. He retains control. He builds his own hybrid bloodline by sharing his blood. What was designed as punishment becomes in his hands a weapon and a dynasty. Then moonlight rings enter the picture, and suddenly the curse isn't even permanent. Magic can modify it, and blood can change it, making the ring another broken mechanic in a world full of overpowered monsters. In the Underworld franchise, lycans aren't created by magic or curses. They come from a biological mutation tied to a deadly plague that reshaped human evolution. Everything traces back to Alexander Corvinus, a 5th century warlord whose body survived the plague and passed its altered genes to his sons, creating the first vampire and the first werewolf. Over time, this split into savage, uncontrollable first-generation werewolves and the more intelligent, shape-shifting lycans descended from Lucian. That divide eventually sparked a brutal war, driven by slavery, forbidden bloodlines, and the rise of powerful hybrids that blur the line between monster and evolution. Lucian changes everything. He's the first lycan, the first werewolf, who can shift back and forth between forms. That makes him valuable in a completely different way than the feral ones, controllable, deployable, and smart enough to eventually realize what's being done to him. His story is a slave rebellion, full stop. He organizes, he trains, he weaponizes the one thing the vampires always needed, but never respected: the raw physical capability of his people. The lycan body in this universe isn't just strong, it's capable of battlefield feats that even vampires can't match. Explosive strength, insane leaping ability, regeneration that keeps them in the fight longer. The vampires needed that, and Lucian turned that need into leverage. Even though Underworld explains its monsters through science and genetics, it still pulls heavily from ancient history and myth. The word lycan comes from Greek legends tied to King Lycaon, but the films reuse the name to separate intelligent, shape-shifting lycans from feral, permanent werewolves while grounding them in real European history. Harry Potter treats lycanthropy as something closer to a chronic illness than a power set, and it's one of the most quietly devastating takes in the whole mythology. Remus Lupin wasn't randomly bitten. He was targeted as a child by Fenrir Greyback specifically to hurt his father. The infection is the violence. The wound never heals, it just changes shape every month. Wolfsbane potion lets him keep his mind during transformation, which sounds like a solution until you realize that the transformation still happens, the pain still happens, and the social consequences never stop. Remus Lupin and Fenrir Greyback are packed with Roman and Norse wolf references, linking them to legendary figures raised by wolves or destined to bring destruction. At the same time, lycanthropy works as a modern allegory. J.K. Rowling has said it mirrors HIV or AIDS, focusing on fear, stigma, and discrimination rather than monsters, making the condition feel tragically human instead of purely supernatural. The wizarding world doesn't just fear werewolves, it discriminates against them systematically. Employment, community standing, basic trust, all of it denied. Lupin is one of the most capable and decent people in the series, and none of that matters once people know what he is. The wolf doesn't make him dangerous to his friends. The moon does that once a month. The other 11 months, he's just a man trying to get through a world that has already decided what he is. Greyback is the counterpoint, someone who fully embraces the infection as an identity and a weapon, who bites children on purpose, who sees lycanthropy as a recruitment tool. Two werewolves, same condition, completely different relationships to what it means. Being human, both the UK and US versions, frames the whole thing around coexistence and management. The werewolf character lives with a vampire and a ghost, and together, they're trying to hold on to their humanity against conditions that keep pulling them towards something else. The transformation is treated like a relapse. Safe rooms get prepared, chains get used, you lock yourself down, and you try to make sure nobody gets hurt. And then you wake up with gaps in your memory, and you spend the next week hoping you didn't do anything you can't come back from. Werewolves are treated as cursed people rather than heroic monsters, but the UK and US versions take that idea in different directions. The UK series leans into a spiritual origin, framing lycanthropy as a devil-born curse and using it as a clear metaphor for addiction, especially alcoholism, with characters trying to manage an endless cycle they can't escape. The US version shifts the focus toward biology and inheritance, treating the curse like a genetic disease and using it as a metaphor for buried violence and rage. In both versions, transformations are brutal, full moon-driven events that strip away all humanity, reinforcing the idea that being a werewolf is something to fear, hide, and survive, not embrace. The US version also adds a specific rule that does a lot of interesting work. Kill the werewolf who turned you while you're in human form and you can lift your own curse, but not your children's. That clause is heartbreaking because it means the trauma travels forward regardless. The Wolfman from 1941 is basically ground zero for modern werewolf rules, even if most people don't realize how much of it was straight up invented for the movie. Larry Talbot gets bitten. Something ancient and awful flips a switch inside him. Silver can kill him, and no matter how hard he fights it, the story ends badly. What made it hit so hard wasn't the monster makeup, it was the tragedy. Larry isn't evil, reckless, or curious in the wrong way. He's just a decent guy who gets destroyed by something he never chose, and that idea became the emotional blueprint for almost every werewolf story that followed. What's wild is how many classic rules actually start here. The famous rhyme about the man who is pure in heart totally made up for the film, and it's not a warning or protection spell. It's basically saying, yeah, even the good ones don't get out of this. Purity doesn't save Larry, it just makes the loss worse. Same thing with the bite. In older folklore, werewolves usually came from cursed belts or shady deals with the devil, but the Wolfman turns lycanthropy into something infectious, like a disease you catch by accident. That single change reshaped the genre forever. Silver is another big one. While old European traditions already treated silver as a pure metal tied to the moon and divine judgment, this movie is what locks it in as the werewolf's Achilles heel. Killing a werewolf with silver isn't just practical, it's symbolic, like correcting something that never should have existed in the first place. Every movie that uses silver after this is borrowing that meaning, whether it knows it or not. The 2010 remake keeps all of that, but adds extra layers of psychological and family horror. It leans into inherited madness, colonial guilt, and the idea that the monster might be baked into the bloodline itself. The curse isn't just bad luck anymore, it's legacy, and that's the through line connecting both films. The Wolf isn't about savagery, it's about losing control, losing identity, and realizing that being good was never going to be enough to save you. An American Werewolf in London, the classic film doesn't bother with royal bloodlines, ancient prophecies, or secret pacts. It strips the whole idea of werewolves down to something more unsettling. Two backpackers wander into the wrong place, one dies, and the other is stuck with a curse he doesn't understand and can't escape. What makes the movie hit so hard is that there's no mystery prize at the end. The twist is what happens to the people the wolf kills. They don't move on, don't rest, and don't fade away. They linger, rotting, talking, and showing up at the worst possible moments, basically reminding David that every full moon adds more names to the list. It pulls from old Eastern European stories about the unclean dead, but the movie treats it less like folklore and more like emotional torture. His dead friend isn't there to guide him, he's there to tell him the truth. This only stops when David does. Landis also leans hard into symbolism. The pentagram shows up as a warning, not a spell, and even the pub name, The Slaughtered Lamb, feels like a dark joke, an innocent sacrifice meant to keep something worse at bay. And then there's the transformation. No smoke, no magic, no shortcuts. Bones snap, skin stretches, and the camera doesn't blink. It's not mystical, it's biological, parasitic, and brutally physical. That's what makes the horror stick. David isn't fighting a monster inside him. He is the monster, and all he can do is wait for it to happen again. Marvel takes the idea of werewolves and brings that badass feel to werewolves by treating them less like a single curse and more like an entire category of beings. Instead of starting with a human who gets bitten on a bad night, Marvel reaches way back into its ancient history and introduces the Wolfen, also called the Wolfmen, a prehistoric, fully sentient race that existed long before modern civilization. These weren't people who became monsters. They were born this way, living during the same brutal, myth-heavy age as Conan and King Cool, and they could shift forms naturally without pain or loss of control. According to Marvel lore, these early wolfmen were tied to elder gods like Chthon and the wolf lord Varkolak, who basically saw them as his most successful creations. At first, they weren't savage at all. They were noble, intelligent, and powerful, but over time, that influence twisted them, dragging later generations closer to the feral versions we recognize today. That's where characters like Jack Russell come in. When Jack digs into his family history, he learns his curse isn't random. It's a watered-down echo of these ancient beings, reactivated through bad decisions involving the Darkhold, which in Marvel terms is basically the worst book you could ever open. What makes Marvel unlike the others on the list is that Jack's version of lycanthropy is just one lane on the highway. Other characters become werewolves through moon-based artifacts, secret military experiments, or straight-up genetics. Wolfsbane, for example, isn't cursed at all. Her powers are mutant-based, giving her more control and a totally different emotional story. Marvel treats werewolves the same way it treats gods or superpowers, same silhouette, wildly different origins. It's less, this is what a werewolf is, and more, here are 10 ways the wolf shows up, depending on history, magic, science, or really bad choices. Paul Naschy's The Night of the Werewolf feels like it wandered out of a dusty European legend and decided to stay there. This is medieval horror in the purest sense. Iron masks, inquisitions, cursed nobility, and the sense that sin doesn't just haunt you, it follows your bloodline. Waldemar Daninsky isn't some unlucky guy bitten in the woods. He's a nobleman executed in 16th century Hungary alongside Elizabeth Bathory, which already tells you this story lives at the crossroads of history and myth. His punishment is especially grim, a living death sealed away with an iron mask and a silver dagger through the heart, only to be revived centuries later when someone makes the mistake of pulling it out. What makes Daninsky tragic is how little control in general over the transformations he has. He's not just cursed, he's controlled. The film blurs the line between werewolf and vampire lore, turning him into a pawn of Bathory, more servant than monster. Religion matters here. Rituals matter. Sacred objects can both imprison and destroy him, and the only true release comes when he's killed by silver wielded by someone who loves him. WolfCop, on the other hand, grabs that ancient mythology, cracks a beer over it, and asks, okay, but what if a werewolf was an alcoholic psycho? Lou Garou, yes, that's the joke, is a washed-up small-town cop who gets turned during a satanic ritual and accidentally becomes a much better version of himself. The movie leans into French and Cajun Loup Garou folklore, but filters it through grindhouse comedy and modern cynicism. Alcohol fuels the transformation, which sounds ridiculous until you realize it doubles as a pretty sharp metaphor for addiction. What's clever is that Lou doesn't lose himself when he changes. He keeps his intelligence, his badge, and his moral compass. He just gains claws, confidence, and follow-through. The film quietly asks an uncomfortable question. If the monster version of you is more effective, more decisive, and more respected, was the problem ever the curse? WolfCop plays it for laughs, but underneath the jokes, it's still wrestling with the same old werewolf question. What if the beast isn't the downfall, but the upgrade? GingerSnaps throws out ancient gods and dusty prophecies and instead builds its werewolf myth straight out of biology, blood, and growing up. The movie opens with something stalking the suburbs, a vague, almost urban legend creature that feels less like a named monster and more like a spreading problem. When Ginger gets bitten on the same night she gets her first period, the film doesn't treat that as coincidence. It locks the moon, the bite, and menstruation together into one brutal idea. This isn't a curse from the past, it's puberty with teeth. What makes the mythology hit is how slow and personal it is. Ginger doesn't flip a switch and turn into a wolf overnight. The changes creep in: anger, confidence, hunger, sexuality, long before the claws show up. The curse works like an infection, something parasitic that rewrites her behavior before it rewrites her body. That idea taps into ancient fears about blood mysteries, when women's cycles were treated as dangerous or monstrous, but the movie reframes it in a modern, painfully honest way. Growing up isn't magical. It's uncomfortable, isolating, and sometimes terrifying. Even the attempted cure sticks to that grounded approach. Wolfsbane, which used to be a mystical ward in old folklore, gets treated like experimental medicine. Brigitte isn't chanting spells. She's trying to inject her sister with a homemade drug before the change becomes permanent. And when Ginger starts losing her sense of right and wrong, the horror isn't that she's becoming an animal, it's that she's becoming someone society doesn't know how to deal with. At its core, GingerSnaps is less about the monster and more about the fallout. It asks what happens when the girl who was supposed to mature quietly turns into something uncontrollable.